Intermediate Accounting 2 students, welcome to my whiteboard. Welcome to my whiteboard. Okay, I'm just going to introduce the lease accounting for lessees. Where's my marker here? For lessees. Okay, so this is the people that are leasing a piece of equipment. What does leasing even mean? What is a lease? What are we talking about? So let's talk about what a lease is. Okay, a lease is basically a contract with required payments for use of an asset. That's what a lease is. And what are the accounting issues with leases? So the accounting issue with a lease is a lease a liability or is a lease a rental? That's basically the fundamental question here. So some of you may have read in the KESO textbook the introductory story, which basically is talking about how companies record leases on their balance sheet or lack thereof. They may not even record a lease on their balance sheet, because if you record a lease on your balance sheet, you're going to put an asset and a liability on your balance sheet. So why wouldn't a company want to put an asset and a liability on their balance sheet? Well, it has to do with how it affects the financial ratios and portrays the financial health of the company. Okay, so for example, I put a couple of ratios up on the board here, which the textbook doesn't actually do for you. It talks about companies not wanting to put a liability on their balance sheet, but it doesn't talk about basically how that affects what the balance sheet is going to look like. So let's take a look at some of the some ratios that are affected by putting a liability on a balance sheet. So the debt to equity ratio, for example, before you put leases on a balance sheet, it could be 2 to 1. So that means that for every $2 of debt, you have $1 of equity. That's kind of an industry standard, like for all industries, right? Like before somebody lends to you, they want to know that the shareholders have put some money in, that they call it skin in the game. They have an investment in the company as well. Significant enough of an investment that they wouldn't want the company to fail. They wouldn't want to walk away from that investment. So before a lease, it could be 2 to 1. And after adding leases, it could be 3 to 1, which basically makes the ratio look a lot worse. Okay, another ratio that could look a lot worse is a current ratio. So a current ratio would be your current liabilities compared to your current assets. So your current assets would be represented by the first number in the ratio, and then the second number in the ratio would be your liabilities. And then after adding a lease to your balance sheet, it could be 1 to 1.5. That means that your current assets can't cover your current liabilities if we were in a liquidation situation where you need to sell all your assets to cover your liabilities. Okay, so it makes it look worse. And one of the reasons why is because there's little to no down payment in a lease. So usually what you would do is you'd use some cash in the company, or you'd raise money through equity, and then these ratios wouldn't look so bad after. Okay, even if you provided a down payment, but there's little to no down payment in a lease. Okay, and that's what makes a lease so useful to a company, is that there's not a lot of upfront costs when you lease an asset. Okay, so that's one of the perks over top of purchasing the asset, taking a big chunk of cash as a down payment, and buying an asset, because traditional finance companies like banks that loan companies funds to purchase assets, they usually want a great big down payment, because again, they want the company to have some skin in the game. So why would a company that leases assets want less of a down payment? Well, for whatever reason, they might be tied into the industry, have some industry knowledge, and they're okay with having the underlying asset, the asset held as collateral, come back to them, and then they could resell it later. They could lease it out again, or they might have some use for it if it comes back to them. But we'll talk about how leases happen in the first place, I think maybe in a separate video. I just want to introduce leases right now. What types of leases are there? Okay, so for a lessee, there's two types of leases. So the first one is an operating lease. The second one is a capital lease. Okay, an operating lease, capital lease. Sorry, I kind of drew over some of my words, but I wanted to really hone in on these two types of leases. So an operating lease is basically just like a rental payment, and you wouldn't be putting the asset that you're leasing on your balance sheet as an asset, and you wouldn't be putting your obligation to pay the lease payments as a liability on your balance sheet either. Okay, so that's an operating lease. It's like rental. Okay, it's just like a rental. And so every time you make your payment, the payment is a rent expense. Okay, and so by now we know how to make rent expense journal entries. You either accrue the rental expense, or you pay it and record the payment as a rent expense. Okay, and a capital lease is like an asset pledged as security for a loan. So a capital lease is, we would get the asset, we would record the asset on our balance sheet, and then we would also record the lease liability on our balance sheet. Okay, so we're dealing with two different types of accounting standards here. So we do have operating leases for both IFRS and ASPE. So with IFRS, you would record an operating lease if it was a small amount or a short duration. So the thresholds for IFRS are less than $5,000 or less than a year. Okay, so it's less than $5,000 or less than a year, and it can be an operating lease. With ASPE, an operating lease occurs when all three tests to test whether this should be whether the lease should be recorded as an operating lease or capital lease fail. Okay, so let's look at what a capital lease is. This might make more sense under ASPE when I talk about what a capital lease is. Okay, so for IFRS, almost all leases are capital leases because most equipment or premises that companies lease are more than $5,000, and the lease usually lasts more than a year. Okay, so most leases would be capitalized under IFRS. And with ASPE, it would pass one of three tests. And I won't explain what the three tests are right now. Maybe I will in a later video, but you can read it in your notes, in your textbook. There's online videos as well that are available to you. Okay, so I'm just introducing the key topics here. Okay, so I just want to say, it doesn't matter whether or not you classify something as an operating lease or capital lease. Leases are like rent in that the payment is made at the beginning of the period. So before you can take the piece of equipment home, or before you can use the premises that you leased, you have to make an upfront payment. You have to make your first payment and pay perhaps most of the time there's some sort of upfront lease cost, some processing fees that you might have to pay. Okay. Now, there's key differences between ASPE and IFRS regarding leases. I guess I could summarize the key difference in that under ASPE, the asset equals the equipment. Okay, so it's as if you purchased equipment and took it to your business premises and then you begin using it. Okay, so but with IFRS, the asset is not actually the tangible piece of equipment. Under IFRS, the asset is the contract itself. It's the right to use the asset. So under IFRS, it's right of use. So it's your right to use that asset. That's the actual asset itself. It's kind of like a derivative almost. So the lease contract right here, the contract, that's the asset under IFRS. Okay, and because a lease is actually, it's a contract with required payments for use of an asset. And I actually really like the discussion that the KESO textbook has about what actually is an asset. And it kind of gets a little bit philosophical. I think it mentions like a philosopher or something like that, which I thought was really neat, because actually that really is an asset, right? Your right to use it. If you have something in your possession but you don't have the right to use it, then you don't really have that, do you? So I think IFRS looked beyond the surface, I think, and IFRS again is supposed to be more based on principles. ASPE is based on accounting principles as well, but IFRS I would say more so. So that's our introduction to what leases are from a lessee's perspective. When you would put an asset on your balance sheet, when you would put a liability on your balance sheet, when you enter into a lease contract, when you wouldn't, and the difference between ASPE and IFRS, the fundamental differences between the two. Okay, hopefully you guys enjoyed this video, and if you have any questions, please feel free to email me or post on the discussion boards, and I'll be checking in with you guys to see how you're doing with this topic.